Hello and welcome back to the Wargamer and another Age of Sigmar painting tutorial. This time I'm tackling another one of the miniatures from the Silver Tower box set, notably the Excelsior Warpriest, and I'll be using the Citadel range of paints to do so. So here we have the Excelsior Warpriest I'll be painting as part of this tutorial. As you can see, I've already primed it using the Uniform Grey spray primer from the Army Painter, as I do prefer to use a grey primer on these brightly coloured miniatures. Now you may notice that this miniature is missing a few components, and I've kit these separately. As you can see here, I've got the cape as a separate piece, the small hammer that sits on the side there, also the prayer book, and finally the head have all been kept separate, as it makes painting these areas a lot easier, so I don't have to push my brush into these nooks and crannies to reach these areas. I can paint them quite freely. Now the first task in painting this miniature is to paint all of the red areas first. This includes the trim on the robes there, and also the cloak itself. And we're starting off with a base coat of Khorne Red, followed by a glaze of Evil Sunz Scarlet mixed with Lamium Medium. Then we'll be washing over the surface using Carroburg Crimson before finally highlighting using Fire Dragon Bright. So the first step in painting this miniature is to apply the Khorne Red across the surface here. Now I've mixed in just a small amount of water to improve the coverage and make it a lot easier to control the paint. However, it should cover really nicely over this grey, as it is a base paint, so you should have no trouble here. Just making sure I get a nice and even coverage across the surface that we can build up on in later steps. With the base coat completed, the next step is to start bringing out some of the brightness in the cloth. Now I've got my Evil Sunz Scarlet here, and I've mixed in roughly equal parts Lamium Medium to Evil Sunz Scarlet. And I'll be applying this over the raised sections of the ridges in this glaze. And what this will do is quite bright at the moment, but when it dries it'll fade out slightly. And what I'm able to do is just to build up several layers, allowing the first layer to dry completely. And this will create a really nice gradient going from the darker sections of Khorne Red in the recesses to the bright sections of Evil Sunz Scarlet on the ridge. So what we want to do is, when this is dried, we're going to be applying a second layer, but we'll be focusing mainly towards the tip here, and this will create a nice gradient going between the two. And I'll be applying the same techniques across the rest of the cloak here, and also across the other red areas on the miniature, so that'll be the trim on the robes, the prayer book, and also the section on the belt as well. With the Evil Sunz Scarlet glaze completed, you should have this nice gradient going from the Evil Sunz Scarlet at the top of the ridges down to the darker Khorne Red in the recesses. Now we're going to further enhance this and tie these two layers together with a Carroburg Crimson wash. Now mix in a small amount of water, roughly 2 parts Carroburg Crimson to 1 part water, and we're going to be applying this over the surface. We want it to pool into the recesses to really bring out the depth in the cloak, and it'll give us some really nice deep red colours to work with. It'll also enhance some of these detailings at the bottom as well, these lightning bolt detailings, and we don't want to apply it too thickly because we want to obscure the nice gradients that we've achieved in the last step. We want to make sure we apply this coat across the entire surface. The final step in painting the bright red areas of the miniature is to apply very thin highlights of Fire Dragon Bright. We're applying these to areas where you would expect the light to be hitting from above. So if you imagine light sources coming from this direction, it would be hitting things around the collar here. We just want to apply a very small highlight of the Fire Dragon Bright just along the top here. As you can see, I'm just being very carefully just applying this very gently along the collar. And I've mixed in some water again here, roughly equal quantities of Fire Dragon Bright and water. And this gives me a much more subtle highlight on the surface. I'm just again going to be picking some of these sections out on the shoulders. And if you're feeling adventurous and you have a thin enough brush, you can also paint a very small line going along these ridges here, especially the more pronounced ones that we've got on these two sections here. With the bright red areas of the cloak finished, the next step is to turn our attention to the inside of the cloak here. Now you can see I've already base coated using Khorne Red, and the same has been done to the cover of the prayer book there as well. And the first task in painting these areas is to wash over them, first of all, using Nuln Oil, and then when this is dried, we'll now be highlighting using Pink Horror. So we're going to be using our Nuln Oil here to wash over the surface, and this will really darken the colour of the red and really gives us nice dark red that we can build up from using the Pink Horror in the next step. And what we want to do is make sure that this wash gets into all of these recesses here and really brings out this mottled detail that we've got on the cloak. Once the wash is dried, the next step is to just perform a very fine highlight using the Pink Horror. Now most of this cloak will be hidden behind the rest of the miniature, so you don't need to worry too much about getting this right. But one of the areas I want to focus on here with the highlights is just this edge here. Now I've mixed in some water with the Pink Horror just to thin it down. Don't want it to be too bright against the dark red. I'm just very carefully dragging it along this edge where we've got the seam between the darker red sections and also the lighter red sections here. And this will just be visible towards the side of the miniature when all the pieces are assembled. So now that both sets of red areas have been completed, the next step is to start painting the white areas on the miniature. And this is going to be mainly the robes that we've got here. We're starting off with a base coat of Celestra Grey, followed by a layer of Ulthuan Grey before applying a second layer of White Scar. So the first task is to apply a base coat of the Celestra Grey over the entire surface of the robes, as you can see I'm doing here. And I've mixed in just a small amount of water here just to improve the flow slightly. Now you may be wondering why I am applying a grey base coat over a grey primer. Well, that's because the Celestra Grey is significantly lighter than the primer that we've got here, so it'll just make building up the layers to get to the pure white that we want that much easier. So the next step is to apply the Ulthuan Grey across the surface here. I've just mixed in some water again, just roughly 1 part Ulthuan Grey to 1 part water. You can see here I'm painting over the surface pretty much in its entirety. However, what I'm doing is I'm leaving the slightly darker Celestra Grey visible in the recesses. It might be quite difficult to see on this miniature here, but there's a very, very subtle difference between the two colours. And this is what we want. We don't want any harsh changes between the two. We want a very nice subtle blend. Now the final step in painting the white areas is to apply a mixture of Lamium Medium and White Scar over all of the surfaces, again leaving the darker greys visible in the recesses. And the reason why we've made a glaze of this again is we want the subtle highlight to be ever so slight between the two colours. So I'm going to be building up these layers. So I'm going to apply the first layer of White Scar and Lamium Medium, wait for that to dry, and then I'll be applying a second one over the top. With the white areas of the miniature completed, the next step is to paint all the black leather areas. This includes the gloves, the boots, and also some of the central sections on the belt there as well. I'm painting all of these areas first of all with Abaddon Black, followed by a highlight of Eshin Grey, before finally highlighting with a Dawnstone. Now Abaddon Black is a base paint, so you should have no problems covering over these areas like so. Just be careful when painting close to the areas we've already painted, not to overspill. As you can see here, I'm just slowing down the painting process to get close to the red areas and just making sure that I don't overspill into those areas. With the Abaddon Black base coat completed, we can now start the highlights on the black areas. So I'm going to use my Eshin Grey here, and I've got a very thin brush. I'm just going to be very carefully picking out these edges along these leather areas. You can see here I'm just running the brush very gently along the top. I've just got a small amount on the tip as well. This makes applying this a lot easier. I've also mixed in just a small amount of water in with the Eshin Grey. It makes it a lot easier to control the paint, especially when you're doing these fine highlights along these edges. Now the final step in painting the black areas is to highlight them using the Dawnstone, and this time I'm just going to be focusing on some of the upper edges. So for the boots here, it's going to be these sections just across the bridge of the foot like so. We want to imagine the light coming in from above and reflecting off the shiny leather surface of the boots. Now when it comes to painting areas such as the fingers here, on the gloves, we're just going to be picking out the knuckles instead. So across the first knuckles here, I'm just going to be applying some small dots of the Dawnstone, and that will really bring out the details. The next step in painting our Excelsior Warpriest is to paint the skin areas, and we're starting off with a base coat of Rhinox Hide, followed by a layer of Mournfang Brown mixed with Lamium Medium, and then we'll start highlighting, first of all with Bugmans Glow, followed by Cadian Fleshtone. With the Rhinox Hide, we just want to get a nice and even base coat in which we can build up the skin tone from in later steps, and again just make sure you don't overspill onto the white areas when painting this, especially when you're painting the areas such as this left arm here. Now, mixing in a small amount of water will help with this brush control here, and also applying the mixture. And also, applying a couple of thin coats as opposed to one thick coat will also give you better overall coverage. With the base coat completed, the next step is to use the Mournfang Brown as a layer across the skin areas. And I've mixed in roughly 1 part Mournfang Brown to 1 part Lamium Medium here, just to create a nice thin glaze. And the reason why I want to do this, I want to be very subtle in the transitions here. I don't want to be very strong in my movement from Rhinox Hide to the lighter Mournfang Brown. I'm just picking out each of these muscle sections here, leaving the darker Rhinox Hide visible in the recesses. And once this is completed, I'll be applying a second coat, again just applying it over the top of the surfaces, leaving the darker sections visible in the recesses. This will really bring out the muscle definition in the miniature. With the layer of Mournfang Brown completed, the next step is to bring out some of the detail, especially in the facial features here. So I've got my Bugmans Glow. I'm just going to be carefully picking out some of these facial features, such as the nose there and also across the brow. I don't want a small amount here. I've just mixed in some water as well, just to improve the flow slightly and make it so I'm not applying quite as much with these strokes. You can see here I'm just bringing out the detail in all of these facial features like so. The final step in painting the facial features is to highlight with Cadian Fleshtone. Now in the previous step we pretty much highlighted all of the raised sections on the face. This time we're just going to be applying some very small ends on the extreme parts. So for example the edge of the nose here, just on the lips as well, also the chin, and then also on the ears like so. This will make these details stand out even more so. With the skin completed, the next step in painting our Excelsior Warpriest is to paint all of the scrolls that we've got adorning the miniature. So we've got them just on the sides here and also just on the back of the robe here. And we're starting off with a base coat of Rakarth Flesh, followed by a wash of Seraphim Sepia, before finally highlighting using Ushabti Bone. So for this step, we just want to get an even base coat of Rakarth Flesh across these scroll areas. Mixing in a small amount of water will help with this, as it will thin down the mixture, make it easier to apply. And also, if you wait for this first layer to dry and apply a second one, it will give you the best and smoothest coverage possible. The next step in painting the parchment areas is to wash over them using the Seraphim Sepia. I'm just applying this over the surface here. It'll pull into these recesses and give us this nice weathered parchment effect across the surface. After the wash, the next step is to highlight over these areas of parchment, like here, just using the brush along the edges here just to pick out the edges like so. And this will just enhance the colour of the parchment, really bring out some of the detail as well. And if you want to, you can even use your brush to pick out some of the scripture that's written onto the actual scrolls themselves. However, I would recommend only doing this if you've got a thin brush like I have and a steady hand. With the scroll work completed, the next step is start painting some of the gold areas on the fabrics. This includes these lightning bolts here and the trim there, and also the areas on the cloak as well. Now we'll be applying a non-metallic metal effect to these areas. But if you're not comfortable with that, you can also just wait until we start painting the other gold areas and follow the exact same steps for that instead. Now we're starting off with a Mournfang Brown base coat before applying a layer of Balor Brown, and then we're applying a highlight of Ushabti Bone and then a final extreme highlight of White Scar. So for this step, I'm just applying the Mournfang Brown across these raised sections on the robes there, just picking out the details like so. Just use a thin brush for this, mixing a small amount of water as well to improve the control of the brush. Just a very small amount, maybe about 3 parts paint to 1 part water, and that should do you. Now if you do overspill, it's not a problem because you can just touch up the areas, especially on the white areas, just with a little bit of White Scar, and that should cover up nicely. With the base coat of Mournfang Brown completed, the next step is start painting the Balor Brown over the top of these areas. Now what we want to do is just want to focus on picking out some of the raised sections. So for on these lightning bolts that we've got here, I'm going to be painting very carefully these edges just on these sections of the lightning bolts. And again, just on this section here. And you can see I'm leaving the Mournfang Brown visible in the recesses. Still, we want to have that nice contrast between the yellow and the brown colour. But as you can see, the one I've already done here, you can see that I've got the Balor Brown going along the surface, and it kind of peaks along these tips here in terms of the strength of the colour. And then we've still got the darker sections just on the other side here. So we're going to do the same across the whole miniature, wherever we've got these Mournfang Brown sections that we painted in the previous step. And we just want to focus, again, just making sure that we pick out the top sections, leaving the Mournfang Brown visible in the recesses. With the layer of Balor Brown completed, the next step is to form a highlight using Ushabti Bone. This time we're going to be picking out some of the thin ridges that we've got along these sections here. So very carefully with the thin brush, I'm going to be picking out this corner here where we've got the trim, and then also along the lightning bolts as well. So again, just very lightly with the brush, I'm going to focus on these corner sections as well. This will really emphasize the non-metallic effect, and it will look like light is bouncing off these raised sections and being reflected. The final step in picking out these sections is to just apply a very small dot of White Scar over the top of the areas where we painted the Ushabti Bone last time. This time we'll just be focusing on the very corners here, just applying very small dots just to represent light reflecting off them. As you can just about see I'm doing here, just a small amount of paint on my brush there. So the next step in painting our Excelsior Warpriest is to tackle the handle that we've got on the Warhammer there. We're starting off with a base coat of Screamer Pink before applying a highlight of Pink Horror. For this step, I'm just painting the stock of the handle here, just the leather straps that are wrapping it around. Just being very careful not to overspill onto the hand. We just want to get a nice even coverage to start off with that we can highlight in later steps. Now the final step in painting the handle here is to use the Pink Horror and just to pick out some of these ridges that we've got just in here, just to enhance these straps that are surrounding the handle like so. Just a small amount, again, just being careful not to overspill onto the areas we've already painted. Now the next step in painting this miniature before we move on to the metallic areas is to paint the inside of the prayer book here. Now we're using 3 different colours to do this, and we're using painting text and symbols on the inside of the book there. And we'll be using Abaddon Black, Mechanicus Standard Grey and Mephiston Red. So first of all, I'll be using Mephiston Red to create a nice crescent moon effect, and to do this I'm going to apply 3 small dots. The first one at the top of the crescent, the second one about midway down, and then the third one to the tip. Like so. And then once we've done all these 3, we can join these 3 dots up like so. And create a nice crescent moon, and just fill this in to create a crescent moon effect on the page. With some red symbols completed, the next step is to use the Mechanicus standard grey to create an area where you'd expect some illustrations to be performed. So again, we're just going to be applying 4 dots just to mark out a square, like so. Once we're happy with those positions, we're going to join them all up with the paintbrush. Again, you only really need to do this if you're confident with your brush control to create these small symbols. And then we're going to fill it in like so, making sure we stay within the boundaries. The final step is to paint in the text, and for this I'm using the Abaddon Black, and I've got quite a small point on the tip of the brush here. I've mixed in some water as well just to make the flow better. I'm going to be very carefully dragging this along horizontally across the page very lightly, like so. We want to break up the lines as well just to symbolise sentences and larger words taking precedence. We want to do this across the whole of the prayer book wherever there's space to do so. The next step in painting our Excelsior Warpriest is to tackle some of the silver areas. This includes the inner section of the hammer there, the shaft as well, the scale armour just underneath the robes, and a few other areas as well. I'd recommend taking a look at the Games Workshop miniature to find out exactly which areas you need to paint silver. Now we'll be starting off with a base coat of Ironbreaker, followed by a wash of Nuln Oil, before finally highlighting using Stormhost Silver. Now I'm using Ironbreaker as I want to get quite a nice and bright metal colour, so I don't want to use lead balch, which is quite darker than this. However, because it's not a base paint, you will need to apply a couple of coats. Just mix in a small amount of water each time and then allow the first coat to dry thoroughly before applying the second one, and this will give you the best coverage possible. With the silver base layer applied, the next step is to wash over these areas with the Nuln Oil, and as you can see here, it's pooling into these recesses. I'm just going to spread it out a little bit there, we don't have to apply too much. And this will really bring out the detail. It'll pull into the recesses, darken the colour out a bit as well, which will really make the Stormhost Silver highlight we'll be applying next stand out. As you can see here, making sure I get it into all of these recesses, like so. The final step in painting the silver areas on this miniature are to pick out some of the details. So for example, on the shaft here, I'm just going to be picking out some of these studs, like so, using the Stormhost Silver. Just really enhancing these details as well, really bringing out the brightness of the metal, simulating the light hitting the surface and being reflected off. You can see I'm just making sure that I drag the brush very lightly along the surface, and I'll be doing the same along any other silver surfaces on the miniature. The next step in painting our Excelsior Warpriest is to paint all the gold areas. Now we're starting off with a base coat of Retributor Armour, followed by a wash of Reikland Fleshshade, before finally highlighting using Stormhost Silver. So I'll be applying the Retributor Armour over the remaining areas of the miniature that are left to be painted. Now this is a base paint, which means it will apply really nicely over the grey primer. As you can see here, I'm just making sure not to overspill it onto the areas we've already painted, and just keep it on the grey primer areas that we haven't covered yet. With the gold base coat completed, the next step is to wash over it with Reikland Fleshshade. Now this wash is usually reserved for applying over skin areas, but it works really well over these gold areas, gives us a nice reddish hue to the metal, as you can see here. Just making sure that it pulls into all the recesses and really enhances the details of the gold areas. Now the final step in painting our Excelsior Warpriest is to highlight all of the edges with Stormhost Silver. Now I'm just going to be dragging the brush along this edge here, and this will really brighten the gold colour. As you can see here, I'm just dragging along the edge, and then also the rest of the lightning bolts here, just really bringing out the details, and this will really brighten the metal, give it a really shiny effect. And here we have the completed Excelsior Warpriest, who you can see I've assembled and based. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please do let me know in the comments below, as well as hitting the small right eye in the top right corner of the video in order to vote on which Silver Tower miniature you would like me to tackle next. To be kept up to date with all the future videos and projects that I'm working on, you can do so by hitting the subscribe button and also following my Facebook and Instagram, which you can find links to in the description below. And finally, if you'd like to support me in making more tutorials, you can do so by checking out my Patreon page, which you can find a link to on screen now, and also in the description below. From there, you can donate to me from as little as $1 a month. This will really help me in producing future content, as well as giving you access to monthly surveys, which will help to influence the miniatures I tackle in future videos. So until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.